So I have this ongoing, by the way, tonight is session 16, and today is October the 18th, 2022, one day before my daughter Tara's birthday. And we're all leaving for our annual Cayucas trip tomorrow. Be gone, Jolene and I will be gone for 10 days. So we'll be getting home on a Saturday afternoon, and with a mountain of things to catch up on, and Sunday facing me, and then the next session just a couple of days after that. So this handout that I put together is actually going to cover the next few sessions as well as tonight. Because believe it or not, it takes more than just a few minutes to put these together. And I knew if I did not have at least the next lesson ready before I went on vacation, I would be up a creek without a paddle. So don't let this handout intimidate you. We're not going to try to cover all of it tonight. Actually, we're just going to try to cover the first column. And even though this handout looks, it's just another one of those, how many words can he put on one page again, but it's not as confusing and complicated as it looks like at first. Let me just put it that way. So the last few sessions I've been saying, I'm working really hard to try to simplify things. You look at this, you think, well, you must not be working hard enough. But as I go through this, if I explain it properly, you'll see this really does simplify a lot of information. Where we're taking the last 7 years, the 70th week of Daniel, and at the top I give the primary passages, Revelation 7:14, Matthew 24:21 and 29, Daniel 12:1. Then we would also add, I have it in smaller font just above the that line of the second half, the time of Jacob's trouble, Jeremiah 30 verse 7. So those are the main verses in the Bible that actually specify what we call the Great Tribulation, which I say in the title is the last half of that 70th week. So there's two halves, and they have some similarities, but they have a whole lot of differences. Everything changes in the middle, and that's what we dealt with last lesson. And we'll probably deal more with that as we go on, because I have this new format of what is at the start, what is in the middle, what is at the end, and then I just plugged in Bible verses and a brief comment about each verse, so that as you go down each column, you can see, okay, this is a major event in the passage that refers to it that happens at that point of time along that 7-year timeline. So if you understand it that way, this really does simplify a lot of information. There's like I don't know how many, hundreds of pages, dozens of pages certainly, of information that could be developed from this one page. Many of these single passages could be pages long just by itself. So I want to read underneath the title. I've mentioned this a few times, this idea of the connection in Hebrew of the word seven and the word oath and the word swear. They all come from the same Hebrew root. And that's really important in understanding the Bible. It helps us understand one reason why God chooses the number 7 so often. We say it's a number of completion or perfection, and it is that, but it's more than that. It's God's number of saying, I'm making a promise and I will keep that promise. And regarding Daniel's 70th week, which is 7 years, is basically, we look at it as a lot of bad things are happening. Evil is in charge. A lot of death and destruction. And, we look forward to the end of it, the return of Christ, to end it all. But if you look at that 7 years, under the idea of it being God's oath or God swearing his promises, that last 7 years should really be seen as God basically saying, this is the process I'm going to use during these 7 years to fulfill the promises that will be brought at the return of my Son. And that last 7 years is necessary to get things to where they need to be for those promises to come to pass. So it's a little more positive way of looking at the 70th week or the last 7 years. It's God saying, this must happen, this must happen, this must happen. And it looks really bad at the time, but I've got a plan. It's all working toward a goal. And at the end of the 7 years, when my Son comes back, everyone will be forced to say, God really did mean what he said, and he keeps his promises, and his oath is sure. So I give some basic information about the root idea of 7. And I quote a verse in Genesis 22:16. It's when Abraham offered Isaac, and God stopped him, of course, and then God said, now I know. And so I will swear by myself that I will give to you these promises. Well, those haven't come to pass yet. A lot of them. Most of them haven't come to pass yet that he made to Abraham. So it's going to take these last 7 years in order for God to fulfill what he said to Abraham 4,000 years ago. By myself, I swear I'm going to keep these promises to you because you offered your son. So the word is Sheba, the root idea of 7, and it literally means to seven oneself or to swear. Then I give examples in Genesis 21. That's the story of Abraham and Abimelech, and they fussed about the wells, and they reached an agreement, and they formed a treaty with each other. And so Abraham tells Abimelech, I'm going to swear to you some things, and we're not going to be enemies, and we're going to work this out. And so they named that place Beersheba. Beer means a well, and Sheba is 7. So you'll see in your Bibles, if you look at this reference in Genesis 21:31, you'll have a little center column explanation. Beersheba means the well of the oath, or it could just as well mean the well of the 7. And because back in that day, they would repeat their promise 7 times. That was kind of just their odd way of saying, I really mean it, and I'll do all I can to keep it. And the interesting thing is, there in 21 verses 28 through 30, I think it's 3 times, which 3, of course, is an important number also. It mentions that Abraham offered 7 ewe lambs to confirm the oath. So it's just all that way of saying that 7 is God's way in the Bible of keeping his promises. So what I'd like to do tonight, actually, I'd like to read that bottom little final paragraph there. The above chart and the accompanying scripture passages seek to provide many anchor points that keep us grounded, sometimes backing us into a corner to force us to allow the scripture to guide us, not our own opinions. Some conjecture is necessary due to verses like Daniel 12:9, where it says these things are sealed till the time of the end. And I think there are some things that are still sealed and not revealed yet until we need to know them. So that means regarding some things, there is still some conjecture. But the timestamps that are definite periods of time and other definite descriptions keep us focused on the progression of the timeline, working its way to what Daniel 9:27 calls the consummation. So I'd like to start and point out something that is found in each of the 3 columns and that's Daniel 9:27. So if you could find that in the first column. And the great thing about this verse is it gives three different statements, and each of those three different statements are connected to each of the three points of time along this 7 years. For instance, Daniel 9:27 says he shall confirm a covenant. So we place that at the start of the 7 years. And then it goes on to say, but in the middle of the week, the covenant is broken. It actually uses language of the sacrifices are stopped, but that means the covenant is broken. So you have the covenant beginning, you have the covenant broken, and then that verse ends by saying until the consummation or the end of that whole process. So that one verse, this is what I mean by anchor, or that it backs us into a corner. You take that one verse, Daniel 9:27, and you see three different time stamps along this 7 years. And so it just kind of keeps you grounded. Okay, I'm going to build on that. What can I plug in to each of those three parts of that single verse that happens at that point in time? As we go through these over the next few sessions, obviously, I could not put all of the verses that I could that could be included in each of these columns. So this is just representative of some of the more important ones. For instance, if you have a pencil or pen and would like to write this in, above Ezekiel 38:17, which we'll turn to in just a minute, I have handwritten in Daniel 9:26, where that's the verse that talks about the prince to come. So these are statements that speak about the beginning of the 7 years. There is a prince that will come. And then Revelation 13:1, I think I wrote that one down. Revelation 13:1 is John's way of saying the same thing, where he says, and I saw a beast rise up out of the sea. That's at the beginning of the 7 years. Those are just different verses and different terminology that say the same thing. The beast rising up out of the sea is the prince to come in Daniel 9:26. But I did put on the handout Ezekiel 38:17. I've really come to like this verse through the years because this lets us know that the Antichrist figure, this man of sin, this beast out of the sea, was a well-known figure to the prophets all through the Old Testament. So Ezekiel 38:17 says, thus says the Lord God, are you he of whom I have spoken in former days by my servants, the prophets of Israel, who prophesied for years in those days that I would bring you against them? Who's the you? Let's back in the first verse or second verse, Gog. Gog is one of the names for the Antichrist. Gog of the land of Magog. So Gog is his name. Magog is where he's from. And he's the chief prince of Rosh, Meshach, and Tubal. Prophesy against him. Well, verse 3 says, thus says the Lord God, behold, I am against you, O Gog. Okay, what verse do you think of way back in the beginning where this would be like drawn from? I am against you, and I've always been against you. I've spoken against you in verse 17. My prophets have spoken against you. You're the one that we're all aware of, that we're familiar with, that we've talked about. Well, verse 3, I am against you, O Gog, is just drawn from Genesis 3:15. You know, that first great prophecy of the two seeds and the two heads of the seeds, and the one's going to bruise the heel and the other's going to bruise the head. You know, that's Christ and Antichrist. That's the two individuals, leaders of the two seeds, but it also includes the corporate, the seeds as a group of people as well that are connected to those two leaders. Well, okay, a few thousand years later, actually over 3,000 years later, God is still saying to that serpent that he said back there in Genesis 3:15, I'm still against you. I've been against you the whole way. So I just really like that verse because it lets us know that this is not an unfamiliar person. He was well known. Then as we go down through this column, we go past Daniel 9:27. He shall confirm a covenant. So let's go over to Daniel 9, and we'll try to do this in a pretty orderly, organized fashion tonight. My goal tonight is to not go home angry with myself for having violated my promise of trying to simplify large, complicated subjects. Daniel 9:27. If you research this, different commentaries, different language books, so on and so forth, you notice that it does not say that he's making or inventing or drawing up something brand new. He's confirming a covenant that's already in existence in the sense that to Israel, to the ones he's making the covenant with, they are well aware of it. It's their ancient covenant. You go back to Genesis 12 and 15 and 17, and basically all those promises that God made to Abraham as they work themselves out through history boils down to three things, doesn't it? Their right to exist, their right to their land, not some other location, that land that God brought Abraham to and promised that he would inherit it, and then their right to access to the Temple Mount. I think those are three main elements that will be confirmed. In other words, the idea of confirming, or the literal meaning is to make strong, to make firm. So the idea is that these are principles already in place, at least to the Jewish nation, that this man of sin will agree to, will confirm, will say, okay, we will let you, we will honor your right to exist, to your land, to the Temple Mount. He doesn't necessarily see it or agree with it in his heart. In fact, he hates it. We're going to look at that in just a minute. In chapter 11, verse 28 and 30, that same covenant that is confirmed, and this is the reason I made those three main points about what Israel has always wanted and what their enemies have never been willing to accept, is because Israel has always seen it as the Holy Covenant. Verse 28, he doesn't see it as the Holy Covenant. He hates it. He hates them. He hates their covenant. He hates having to agree to it. But it's called the Holy Covenant. And then in verse 30, it's called the Holy Covenant twice. So from that language, then we go back to 9:27, and that covenant that is confirmed, called here the Holy Covenant, in Bible language, it's easy to conclude what I concluded. Their right to exist, their right to their land, their right to their Temple Mount. Because in the same chapter, chapter 11, in verse 23, here's what he considers it after the league is made. See, he doesn't consider it anything holy or precious or valuable. He just considers it a league, something less than a covenant, certainly not holy. in his mind, it's just, you know how I describe this covenant that is confirmed from the standpoint of the Antichrist and the 10-nation confederation that is aligned with him? I think they will look at it as a necessary evil. In other words, they will see it as a necessary termination of a current conflict that they are losing, to end hostilities, to agree to things they would never agree to. See, that's the picture I'm trying to paint, is that Israel's enemies are going to agree to things they never would agree to unless they feel forced to do it. I think that's the whole picture being drawn here. Because if we go back to verse 28 again, 11:28, I just wanted to pick up Holy Covenant before, but now I want to move back a few words. His heart shall be moved against. See, he was always against it. But now he's figured out a way and a time to act on it. And that's the middle of the week when he breaks the covenant. But I think in his mind and heart, he's always been against it. When we go down through this column, we start looking at who those 10 nations are. We know that today they are all Muslim majority nations. Therefore, it's easy to understand they're all against what Israel wants. They're all against the Holy Covenant. But they have to agree to it for a period of time, 7 years. They figure out a way to break it in the middle of those 7 years. So this idea of against, also in let me see, there's another place where it mentions against, and I think I have it here in this column. Verse 30 again. Yeah, okay. And return in rage. So he's not just against it, he's in rage against it. See, I think what the language is trying to tell us is that what is coming out of him in the middle of the 7 years has been there all along. And for 3.5 years, he's been trying to figure out a way to break this agreement, because no doubt Israel is running with it, rebuilding to whatever degree they get to rebuild the temple. They're renewing their sacrifices. They're practicing their religion up there next to the mosque, to the Dome of the Rock. I mean, can you imagine what kind of rage that will cause in the Muslim nations to see that in their face on a daily basis? But they've had to agree to it to end the hostilities that were going on, that we'll look at in just a minute. Now, if we go to Isaiah 28, verse 15 and 18, I know this is earlier than Daniel by quite a ways, but I think the language here is talking about the same thing at the same time. Because it says in verse 15, because you have said, we have made a covenant with death, and with Sheol we are in agreement. When the overflowing scourge, that's just Isaiah's way of describing the Great Tribulation. When the overflowing scourge passes through, it will not come to us, for we have made lies our refuge. Under falsehood we have hidden ourselves. I think what is being described here is Israel will once again violate what God has warned them about all through their history. Don't make agreements with your enemies. It will come back to bite you. It will come back to hurt you. I think Gary J's walking with a tonight at 7 p.m. And then down to verse 18 of Isaiah 28 says the same thing. Your covenant with death will be annulled, and your agreement with Sheol will not stand. See, they said back in verse 15 that when this overflowing scourge passes through, it's not going to come to us. We have this agreement. They've agreed to lay down their arms. They've agreed to allow us, our religion on the Temple Mount. And we can lay down our weapons, and we're going to be in peace. They've all promised it and guaranteed it. They probably have the backing of the United States, China, and Russia, and England, and the major nations to ensure it. And so we feel like they're going to keep their agreement, and it's not going to hurt us. Unfortunately, back in verse 13, it talks about it's a snare. They're going to be caught in that snare. It's going to be like a thief on them, because they made, in verse 15, they made lies our refuge. They made lies our refuge. So they consider that confirming the covenant a refuge for them, because even if you're winning a war, you really don't want a war. Your people are dying. You're spending bazillions of dollars. It could turn against you at any point. And so if your enemies that are being beaten say, let's sit down and work this out. We think we have a way to satisfy you so that you'll stop winning this battle. And Israel agrees to it because they're tired. Winners get tired of wars too. And so it seems to satisfy everyone. Back down to verse 18 again, when the overflowing scourge passes through, then you will be trampled down by it. That covenant that was confirmed, that you thought was your refuge, is going to turn into what Jeremiah called in 30 verse 7, the time of Jacob's trouble. And Daniel 12:1 calls it's going to be a time of trouble like they've never ever had. Worse than the Holocaust, worse than the Spanish Inquisition, worse than anything they've ever faced. So the covenant with death. So as we move through this column, I would like to go now to back to Daniel 11. And some people watching on video who may share it with others who have different opinions will disagree with me on this. But many people who have studied Daniel do not have the actual Antichrist beginning, a direct reference about him until verse 31. But I take it all the way back to verse 21. I think this is, you look at Paul's writings, you look at some of the other prophets, Ezekiel, they all describe the man of sin this exact way. Many people try to make it Antiochus or somebody else in history. But if you follow the antecedent of the pronoun, if you say he doesn't really begin till verse 31, but you look at the pronoun him and he, and you follow it all the way back to verse 21, it's talking about the same person. There is a person in verse 20 that he kind of steps in and takes over. There shall arise in his place one who imposes taxes on the glorious kingdom, but within a few days, he doesn't last long, he shall be destroyed, but not in anger or in battle. That's interesting language. Verse 20 of Daniel 11. And in his place, now here's the Antichrist, but it gives us a clue, because the Antichrist is described as very deceitful, very flattering. He wins mostly with words and politics and economics, only resorting to actual battle, wars, as a last resort. And he is involved in some pretty big battles. But his primary method is through other capabilities. And so when he arises in verse 21, this vile person, I think that gives us a clue as to, we're going to read as we go down through the columns that there are 10 nations, 10 horns, but he overcomes 3 of them and becomes their leader, and then along with the other 7. And so he's able to do this, I think, without anger or in battle. In verse 20, he's able to like conquer some other nation or some other leader through political means or through whatever. You know, we're living a cancel culture right now, so who knows what it's going to be. But he's going to be able to overcome another nation and leader and take over, and that's his rise to power. But he comes in, as we will read, peaceably. That's what I said. That's why I say he's able to overcome this previous man, not in anger or in battle, but peaceably. And in his place shall arise a vile person to whom they will not give the honor of royalty. So he's not like a recognized leader. He's not of a royal bloodline. You know, he's not someone that is very famous when he first comes up, as we'll continue to see. And he shall seize the kingdom by intrigue. So again, that's why I go back to the end of verse 20, that he's going to be able to destroy somebody, but not in anger or in battle, but by intrigue, and take their place. And that's his beginning of his rise to power. With the force of a flood, they shall be swept away from before him and be broken. And also the prince of the covenant. This is one of the most debated topics, because this is the only place he's ever mentioned in the Bible. But the Antichrist is able to overcome some guy known as the prince of the covenant. But I think, just my opinion, is that he's the guy that comes up with the idea of confirming this covenant. He's kind of the leading political force to get it started. Then the Antichrist is able to come in on that and overcome that guy and take over. So this prince of the covenant, you know, during a lot of years, it was not our president. It was not any other world leader. It was Henry Kissinger, wasn't it? That came up with all these solutions to all these world problems. He could be considered like the prince of a covenant. And he was not of royalty. He was not a national leader. You know, he was a secretary of state, or then he had other roles. But I think this prince of the covenant is kind of a flash in the pan. He comes up with a solution. The Antichrist sees an opportunity to step in and take over. And after the league is made with him, he shall act deceitfully. Deceitfully. So he confirms this covenant that he considers a league, not a holy covenant. And right away, he starts acting deceitfully. Okay, I've got it in place. The war is over for now. Israel thinks they're in safety. I'm rising in power. I've got these 10 nations behind me. They may not be all big, powerful nations, but as a group, you know, they're pretty powerful, and they're surrounding Israel. And so I'm going to start working behind the scenes to try to get the upper hand against Israel. He shall act deceitfully. He shall come up and become strong with a small people, small number of people. So evidently the 3 that he overcomes, and the leader that he overcomes, the prince of the covenant, these initial people that he's able to step in, take advantage, and take over what they had, is almost unnoticed at first. And he's not the leader of a big, powerful nation. He starts his rise small. He shall enter peaceably. So he's known as a man of peace at first. Even into the richest places of the province. He shall do what his fathers have not done, nor his forefathers. He shall disperse among them the plunder, spoil, and riches. So he's buying off people. He shall devise his plans against the strongholds. So he's planning, he's deceitful, he's working. Takes him 3.5 years, but he finally reaches a point midway through the 7 years that he thinks he can do it, and it looks like he succeeds. But only for a time. He shall stir up his power, his courage against the king of the south with a great army. So he's the king of the north. He's up around Syria or Turkey. He's able to gather those nations surrounding Israel into a group. But there are some, nations, Muslim nations, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, even Egypt now. There are some big Muslim nations south of Israel that are trying to stay neutral. And they may think this guy's going too fast, too far. And so they try to stop him, which is interesting because, before Islam united a lot of those nations, there is an ancient hatred between Arabs and Persians. We just see all those Muslim nations now, but the Persians, the Arabs hated, they slaughtered each other. Well, those old tribal grudges stay forever. And evidently those southern Arab nations are going to see those northern, more Persian Muslim nations as going too far. And they kind of figure out what he's trying to do. So they try to stop him. But evidently he gets the upper hand, and they kind of come into agreement with him to some degree, start working with him at some point. I guess they figure out they can't overcome him. He shall stir up his power and his courage against the king of the south with a great army, and the king of the south shall be stirred up to battle with a very great and mighty army. So these are evidently Muslim nations fighting each other. But he shall not stand, for they shall devise plans against him. So the king of the south's plans will not work. Yes, those who eat of the portion of his delicacies shall destroy him. His army shall be swept away. Many shall fall down slain. Both these kings' hearts shall be bent on evil. So it's not like there's a good guy and a bad guy. They're both bad guys. They shall speak lies at the same table. I think the idea is that they're conspiring against the covenant. They're trying to figure out how can we not allow that to continue for another 3.5 years. But it shall not prosper, for the end will still be at the appointed time. While returning to his land with great riches, his heart shall be moved against the holy covenant. So he's won this major battle. It's nearing the middle of the 7 years. And so once he's kind of consolidated that, and he's returning to his home base up in Syria or Turkey or wherever it is, he thinks, now's the time to strike. These nations down here, my fellow Arab Muslim nations, they can't stop me anymore. Now's the time to strike. So at the appointed time in verse 29, he shall return and go toward the south, but it shall not be like the former or the latter. Now here's another group trying to stop him. So we tend to think that the whole world is like bowing down to him and doing whatever he wants. But, even though things are wicked and evil during this time, we've always found a way to stop tyrants and dictators from going too far, even if it means world wars. So ships from Cyprus or Chittim, it just means the west. It means the Mediterranean, from that direction. So most, and I agree with this is probably Western powers now are stepping in and saying, hey, we got to put a stop to this thing, or we got a world war in our hands. And so, send out the 7th Fleet into the Mediterranean and show the power of the West and say, let this guy know, we've gone along with you so far, but you're going too far. And we're not going to let you destroy Israel. We're just not. We're going to stop you. You're stepping over a line. Hopefully the United States and the West will still have enough good about them that will try to stop him. Ships from Cyprus shall come against him, and temporarily they'll be able to stop him. Therefore he shall be grieved, return in rage against the whole. So now he's like doubling down. I hate Israel. I hate the covenant. I hate everyone trying to stop me. And so he shall return and show regard for those who forsake the holy covenant. This is why verse 31 is so important. This is why I spent so much time last week on the abomination of desolation. Verse 31 is the middle of the 7 years, the abomination of desolation. And remember what we connected that to? His whole death and resurrection event. What we connect that to? Satan cast down, embodying his man on earth. So basically an incarnation of Satan now into this man of sin. So he is no longer a thug, an antichrist. He is the antichrist empowered by Satan. Now he commits the abomination of desolation. Now he's bold enough to actually march right into Israel's temple, declare himself to be God, and basically announcing by doing that, I'm breaking the covenant, and I'm going to do what I wanted to do all along. I'm going to destroy you. And Israel had placed their confidence in lies, the thing that God told them not to do all through their history. Don't align yourself with these heathen people and think that you can trust them. They would always pay Pharaoh, king of Egypt, or they'd pay the king of Babylon or the king of Assyria or the king of Syria itself. Many times they would come help us against our enemy. And God would send a prophet and say, don't do that anymore. You need to trust in me. Don't trust in these people. So that's why verse 31 is so important. Forces shall be mustered by him. They shall defile the sanctuary fortress, then they shall take away the daily sacrifices and place there the abomination of desolation. So whatever happened with those ships from Cyprus, the Western forces, evidently they were checked. They didn't lose. They stopped him temporarily, but they retreat. Maybe they're trying to negotiate, and he figures out a good time to strike, because now he is empowered directly by Satan. So he breaks it in verse 31. So I asked the question on the handout, why agree to a covenant he hates? And I've already explained, to buy time in deceit, because he rages against the covenant. Now, this 10-nation confederation that he's aligned with, that he rises to power, and there's some conjecture to this. I don't want to be too adamant on this, but there's Psalm 83 mentions a future war. This has not happened yet, so it's still future, but it's a prophecy of a future battle against Israel. And it said, verse 2, for behold, your enemies make a tumult, and those who hate you have lifted up their head. They have taken crafty counsel against your people, consulted together against your sheltered ones. So we read over in Daniel that Israel was saying, we're dwelling in safety. We shall never be harmed. We've reached this big agreement. We believe they're going to keep their promise. So they're sheltered ones. But they have said, come and let us cut them off from being a nation, that the name of Israel may be remembered no more. That's the rage against the Holy Covenant that was there all along. Now they feel like they have the ability to carry it out. For they have consulted together with one consent. They form a confederacy against you. And as you go down through this list, and a list of nationalities in the Bible is often difficult, because you look at any map of that part of the world, century by century, going back a few thousand years, and the maps change drastically, and the names of the regions change. They didn't have defined borders like they do today. So it's kind of difficult. So I like to just call them people groups. And depending exactly how you break this down, but it appears that there are 10 named people groups. So there's that 10-nation confederation. that he rises to power with. And what's interesting is this seems to be, again, we can't press it too far. This is mainly Arabs. This is mainly nations south of them, although it does mention Tyre and Assyria, so we can't press it too far. But it appears it's more just the nations up close surrounding Israel. So it doesn't involve maybe Turkey and Russia and maybe not even Iraq and Iran, some of those. It's interesting that it does not mention Egypt. So evidently Egypt is still somewhat neutral at this time or trying to stay out of it. But there's 10 named groups here. And then we won't even turn there because you're so familiar with it. But in Daniel 2:41, that image of all those kingdoms, and then it gets down to the feet, and then it mentions the toes, the 10 toes. So the 10 name groups in Psalm, there's 10 toes in Daniel 2:41, mixed of iron and clay, and iron and clay do not mix. So I think that's what the day we're living in now, where it's a mixture of Muslim culture and Western culture. That's what's trying to be an experiment right now in Europe, but it's not going so well, is it? Those two cultures just don't mix very well. But somehow they're going to be aligned enough to form this 10-nation group. And then it's the same as mentioned in Daniel 7, and I give 3 verses there. And let's just go read a few of those. Daniel 7 and verse 7. After this I saw in the night visions, and behold, a fourth beast, dreadful and terrible, exceedingly strong. It had huge iron teeth. It was devouring, breaking in pieces, trampling the residue with its feet. It was different from all the beasts that were before it. I don't want to take a lot of time talking about this because time is getting short. But I put a lot of emphasis on that word different in verse 7. And it says the same thing down in verse 24. 10 horns or 10 kings which shall arise from this kingdom, the fourth kingdom, and another shall rise after them. He shall be different than the first ones, shall subdue 3 kings. So just like the Antichrist is different than the 10 horns, and he subdues 3 of them, this fourth kingdom that is normally always said to be the Roman Empire. But I think that needs to be expanded quite a bit. Because the Roman Empire was not that much different. But if you combine the eastern leg, so you remember that image has 2 legs. So if you carry the Roman Empire out a little bit further, divide it into west leg and east leg. And the east leg became the Eastern Orthodox Church, rival to the Roman Church, basically the same thing, just an Eastern version of it. Constantine moved the capital of the Roman Empire to Constantinople, Istanbul, Byzantium. And so the Eastern leg became Muslim, became the Ottoman Empire. And the Ottoman Empire was different than all the previous empires. The Roman Empire was not that much different. So if you put a lot of emphasis on that it was different than those that came before it, I think the idea is that it is the Roman Empire with the emphasis on the eastern leg of the empire that really was different and became primarily Muslim under the Ottomans. But 10 horns are mentioned in verse 7 and 20 and 24. But in chapter 7, verse 8, this little horn, I was considering the horns, and there was another horn, a little one. and that's the Antichrist, coming up among them, before whom 3 of the first horns were plucked out of the roots. There in his horn were eyes like the eyes of a man, and a mouth speaking pompous words, which the New Testament, several places, uses almost exact language to describe the Antichrist. But if you go to verse 24, the 10 horns are 10 kings who shall arise from this kingdom, and another shall arise after them. See, little words make a big difference. These 10 nations were already in place. He comes along and subdues 3 at some point after them. So he's kind of like a Johnny-come-lately in a sense. He starts out small with a small number of people, and then he becomes very powerful. And then John takes this same idea of 10 named groups, 10 toes, 10 horns, and in Revelation 13:1, this beast from the sea is the same idea, 10 horns, 7 heads, because the Antichrist subdues 3 of them. So you have this being carried out all the way through Psalm, Daniel, Revelation. The same idea being carried out. I do want to, and I'm not going to go over and read Revelation 17. We'll get there eventually, 7 through 14, their rise and defeat. But if we go to Ezekiel 38, I just want to point out a couple of short things before we close out. One of the big debates in Ezekiel 38 and 39, the battle of Magog, is when does it happen? See, Psalm 83, to me, seems to be more of a regional war that builds, and Ezekiel 38 seems to include, if you look at the people named in verses 3 through 5 or 6, this list includes other nations further away, such as Persia, would be parts of Iraq and Iran, Ethiopia and Libya. Gomer is Turkey, all the way up into Russia. Togarmah, many people say that Gog, the prince of Rosh, Meshech, and Tubal, includes most of the stands. There's little countries that divided from Soviet Union when it broke up, but they were formerly part of that border Russia. Russia may be involved in some way as well. But this seems to be a more expansive list. So that Psalm 83 group now is expanding, because as the Antichrist, his power grows, evidently there are other nations coming in and working with him. But I want to point something out in verse 4. I will turn you around. Who? God will. Put hooks in your jaws and lead you out in all your army. These nations seem to be more reluctant. They're really not wanting to get involved in this mess. But God is putting hooks in their jaws and dragging them down there. It's kind of like a lot of wars that have expanded through history is because of treaties. Everyone has treaties with each other. And then, if they attack you, then I'll come help you. Well, you hope it never happens. Well, they get attacked. Oh, I don't want to go. But, we've signed this treaty, so we'll do what we can. So part of that is God dragging these, because God is, as I said in the beginning, with the 7 years and the number 7 being about oath and swearing and promises, is that God is in some ways taking reluctant nations who are wanting to stay out of it, bringing them into it. Because he said, by the end of it, I'm going to gather all nations against Jerusalem. And we'll get to that. That's interesting. I have a different take on that than them coming to Jerusalem to destroy Israel, because Israel is almost destroyed already. They're actually rebelling against the Antichrist. trying to stop him because he's on the warpath. But in verse 8 of Ezekiel 38, after many days you will be visited. In the latter years, you will come into the land of those brought back from the sword. So I think what's happening in Ezekiel 38 and 39 is an ongoing war that flares up several times. It's probably what the confirming the covenant stops, at least the Psalm 83 war. That's maybe some of these have gotten involved in that also. And they signed this covenant because, for one thing, they're probably losing to Israel. But I think another thing, the fact that it says God puts hooks in their jaws and drags them down, is that some of these people fighting Israel don't really want to. And so God has to drag them down. But when this Prince of the Covenant comes up with this idea to bring about peace, some of these nations that are not really wanting to be there pressure the Antichrist into going along with it. And at that point, he's not strong enough yet to say no. So he goes along with it. And but in verse 8, so verse 8, you're going to come back into the land of those brought back from the sword. So there's already been a battle, the sword. There's already been fighting that has stopped, but now is going to start again. And gathered from many people on the mountains of Israel, which had long been desolate, they were brought out of the nations, and now all of them dwell safely. So at this point, when the battle is renewed in the middle of the 7 years, when the covenant is broken, Israel is dwelling safely because of this covenant, this treaty. So this is the middle of the 7 years at the end of verse 8. And verse 10, I'll close with that, I think. Thus says the Lord God, on that day it shall come to pass that thoughts will arise in your mind, and you will make an evil plan. That's what we read in Daniel. You'll start acting deceitfully, sit down at the same table telling lies, forming a plan, an evil plan to break the covenant, and finally, once and for all, get rid of Israel. And his evil plan is this, in verse 11. You will say, I will go up against a land of unwalled villages. I will go to a peaceful people who dwell safely. Why? Because of this agreement that was signed. All of them dwelling without walls, having neither bars nor gates. I mean, that hasn't happened. That's not the condition of Israel since 1948 yet, but it will be in the first 3.5 years. And then look, to take plunder, to take booty, to stretch out your hand against the waste places that are again inhabited, against the people gathered from the nations. But look at verse 13. And I'm going to try to develop this further as we go along, because I think it's often overlooked or not highlighted enough, even if it is seen, is that there is not going to be total allegiance to this man, and there are going to be nations that try to stop him. Like in verse 13, who is Sheba and Dedan? That's Saudi Arabia. Sheba and Dedan and merchants of Tarshish. Who is that? Those are the Western nations. Tarshish is over there by Spain. And they're merchants, people are losing a lot of money they're making a lot of money, but some are, but many people are losing a lot of money because of all the death and destruction. And look at this, all their young lions. We don't know who that is, but it's the young lions of Tarshish, which is those of the West. So many people say the young lions then would be those who came from those nations, which would be primarily the United States, Canada, Australia, pretty powerful nations, Western nations. If they are, in fact, the young lions, they're not asking him a question. They're trying to stop him. They're trying to slow him down. They'll say to you, have you come to take plunder? Have you gathered your army to take booty? What are you really trying to do? Therefore, son of man, prophesy and say to Gog, thus says the Lord God, on that day when my people Israel dwell safely, will you not know it? You'll see what's going on. You'll see it's time. You'll come from your place out of the far north, ever how far north that is. You and many people with you, all of them riding on horses, a great company and a mighty army. You'll come against my people Israel like a cloud to cover the land. It shall be in the latter days that I will bring you against my land. It's interesting, isn't it? That's the same thing I've been talking about, like the death of Christ. They rage against the covenant. They hate Israel. They want to wipe them out, but God's working in it at the same time to bring about his end goal, so that the nations may know me when I am hallowed in you, O Gog, before their eyes. And the rest of 38, especially 39, describes how he defeats Gog and ushers in the millennial. But we'll get to that eventually. So that's most of the first column. So I hope I present it in a way that you see it's not as intimidating as it looks at first when you're looking at this whole page. And then I think next session we may pick up some things in the middle column before we go into the third column. And I'm glad the Lord gave me this idea or put it in my heart, because I'm sure there are many out there. I just haven't researched enough to find them on my own. But I've really not seen like these kind of verses and columns laid out along a timeline like this, to try to take just a lot of information and just plug it in along a timeline like this to try to make sense of it, where it all might fit. So I'm going to stop this recording.